This spring when we planted these peppers, we put in a mulch trial at the same time to see how they'd respond to different treatments. Now back here I have landscape fabric, and the peppers seem to have liked that pretty well. It's breathable, water has gotten in, nutrients have solubilized and gone through, and it heated up the soil very nicely, plus weeds have been controlled beautifully. The peppers are setting fruit now and really look quite good. Now over here we have the opposite situation. We used black plastic, and black plastic I think works very well in more northern climates for getting peppers off to an early start, but it got a little too hot for us. Also, it held in too much moisture. As much rain as we have had, we've had a couple plants that have rotted in the ground, and so we probably won't try that treatment next year. Up ahead of me we have this agri-paper mulch, and it has held the weeds down pretty well, but it's starting to decay, and here we are just in the middle of June. So probably that would not be the best treatment unless you plan to follow it up by some organic mulch on top, although the peppers look fairly healthy. Over here we just have bare soil, and those peppers look as good as any of them here, although we have had to hoe it regularly to keep the weeds down. In front of them we put down some straw mulch, and you can really see the effects of putting a lot of undecomposed material on top of the soil around the plants. It has held the weeds down, but it has tied up some of the nitrogen in the soil, and the plants have been stunted. Over here, this seems to be a very nice treatment. We've used newspaper covered over with remade fabric to hold the newspapers down. The plants seem to have fairly even growth, although I'm wondering if even the newspapers might have tied up a little bit of nitrogen. Well, on peppers, some basics about having success with growing them. First of all, they are temperature sensitive. If you've been growing peppers early in the season and noticed that they have bloomed and the blossoms have fallen off, it may be that night temperatures were too cool. Peppers ideally blossom and set fruit when night temperatures are above 60 degrees or below 80 degrees. So late this summer you may see production fall off a bit, but it will pick up again this fall. Now to get your peppers through the season, you need to fertilize them. And there are two ways that you can go about it. If you're an organic gardener, you might want to use compost. Now on this bare soil area, we're going to cover half of it in compost. Now the compost, we can't really give you a specific recommendation for how much to put on, because everyone's compost pile is a little bit different depending on what you've been adding to it. Several advantages to putting compost around peppers or any other vegetables is that it contains a lot of micronutrients that may not be in your commercial fertilizer. Also, it adds organic matter to the soil, and it's in a form that will be released slowly. So we'll see how that does around the plants, and we'll probably add some more later this summer. Now on this same little plot, I'm going to use some complete fertilizer. This is some 31-310 that we've been using on our turf and happen to have on hand. With peppers, if you use a complete fertilizer, one of the ideal ones would be either 10-10-10 or 10-10-20. The reason you want that last number to be slightly higher is that that stands for potassium. And potassium will help produce more flowers in the middle of summer and help with fruit production. If you're using a complete fertilizer such as 10-20-10 or 10-10-10 or 10-10-20, you want to put about a tablespoon around each plant, usually starting 6 weeks after transplanting, and doing this 2 or 3 times during the season. Same way if you're an organic gardener and using compost or using some of the organic fertilizers, peppers like to have a continual supply of food throughout the season. I'll go ahead and add some of this into our straw mulch area as well. One last tip on peppers is that to keep them flowering through the summer and to keep that fruit setting, not only do we want night temperatures to stay below 80, and that's something we don't have control over, but also we want to keep the wind from blowing over them quite so much. We've found over time that wind blowing on the blossoms can dry out the pollen before it has a chance to fertilize that blossom and produce a fruit consequently. So I have a windbreak to show you that may help you have better pepper production through the summertime. Peppers are often pollinated by honeybees, by solitary bees, and sometimes they're just completely self-pollinating. But either way, the wind can really inhibit pollination. Now, in western Oklahoma, where they grow chili peppers, they hire hives of bees or rent hives of bees to go out there and help with pollination. Another thing that helps them, though, is if they plant a windbreak, and that prevents the pollen from drying out before the bees get a chance to pollinate the peppers. So we've set up a mini windbreak here with some landscapers' shade fabric. You've probably seen this used at nurseries to shade tender nursery plants, and later in the show I'll be showing you how to do that very thing in your own garden. Shade cloth comes in different densities depending on the percentage of shade that you want. Of course, if you're using it for a windbreak situation like this, the density isn't really important. You just want to break up those wind currents as they come across the pepper patch. Now, I have extended this around the corner to where it's guarding the southwest side of the peppers because that's where my prevailing winds come from, and it should be quite helpful. Now, shade cloth like this runs anywhere from 50 to 70 cents a linear foot, and usually it's anywhere from 4 to 6 feet wide. I've cut this piece, it was a 6-foot piece, I've cut it into a 3 feet wide piece. And so it's going to work out very nicely for me at very little expense. I've used tomato stakes to attach it to, and initially I stapled it, and then I've secured it with these little electrical cable ties. You can usually buy these where the shade cloth is sold, or go to an electrical supply department at your hardware store, and they usually have them there. And they'll be very handy for attaching to the tomato stakes. If you don't want to go the expensive shade cloth, you can also use burlap. If you don't want to build a windbreak structure, you could grow a fast-growing crop on the southwest side of your peppers to block the wind. Anything will work just fine. You could use hay grazer, which is hybrid Sudan grass, or a quick tall crop of some other grass to block the wind. Anything about 3 feet tall will work. To give you an idea of how well this works, I knew some farmers up in Collinsville, Oklahoma, who could never get peppers to grow in their family garden. So one year they planted them in the corner where a fence was and put up an old tennis net around the corner. And that year they had a bumper crop of peppers. So this would probably be a worthwhile project in your garden if you want to keep peppers growing through the heat of summer. Our main vegetable garden is divided into 3 different parts. Now up at the front we have some sweet corn and vine crops. And then over to the right is our variety garden of tomatoes and peppers, broccoli and beans. Then here in the center, this third section is in cover crop rotation this summer. Earlier this spring we had some Austrian peas and some hairy vetch in there, and we rototilled that under a few days ago, and now we're putting in a warm season cover crop. And one of the best ones you can put in this time of year is mung beans. Now mung beans have an interesting history in Oklahoma. If you ever eat Chinese food and you eat bean sprouts, those bean sprouts were raised in Oklahoma. Oklahoma is the #1 producer for the entire United States of mung beans. And so if you ever eat Chinese food, even in some other part of the country, the bean sprouts were raised here. If you're going to use mung beans as a cover crop, you want to put them in when the ground is warm and when there's plenty of moisture in the soil. Also, since they are a legume, it's a good idea to inoculate that soil with the proper bacterium if you've never raised mung beans there before. Now the rate that Dennis is sowing them at is around 5 to 10 pounds per 1,000 square feet, so we get a nice thick stand. If a farmer were raising mung beans for the seed that are grown for the sprouts, he'd use a much different seeding rate, usually 10 pounds to a whole acre. But since we're raising this for a cover crop and the seed is fairly cheap, he's putting it on really thick. That will enrich the soil this summer, this fall when we turn it under. We'll have more nitrogen released, and this will be in good shape for growing vegetables next year.